In behavioral political economy, we can turn to behavioral economics to think about some cognitive biases. These biases can help us make sense of the questions that can linger, such as how do we have systematically wrong beliefs in politics if they're systematically wrong? What forces exist to create the systematic bias in the political world in the first place? We won't have exact findings, but behavioral econ can help us think about ways in which we'll be biased when there is no cost to being wrong. What fuels our bias in the political world to be confidently wrong about things? We'll consider three different things: confirmation bias, availability bias, and overconfidence. Three large areas of literature exist in behavioral economics covering these concepts. We'll start with confirmation bias. So how do we keep our systematically wrong beliefs if they are systematically wrong? First topic, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias can be defined as the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. Evidence comes in, we tend to process it favorably towards our existing beliefs, and we move on. Confirmation bias should not be true. New evidence should be Bayesian updated and alter our beliefs in the direction of the evidence. In the second edition of A Course in Behavioral Economics, Eric Igner argues that there are three elements of confirmation bias. One, people fail to notice. Even when there's evidence that goes against their beliefs, they don't notice these things, whereas they quickly pick up on evidence that supports their views. Two, how we interpret the ambiguous. When evidence is vague or ambiguous, we interpret it in such a way that supports our own view. And three, there is a standard asymmetry. People apply a higher standard of proof towards contradictory evidence. Let's cover each of these in turn. So first up, a failure to notice. Many have probably seen the idea of change blindness with the invisible gorilla study. You can think about the failure to notice in the invisible gorilla experiments and notice that there's evidence against our beliefs. A 1998 study by Simons, the same author as the invisible gorilla study, has an article called "The Failure to Detect Changes to People During a Real-World Interaction." The idea behind this article is that, sure, maybe we don't see a gorilla in an experiment, but in the real world, how does this actually play out? With the invisible gorilla setup, there's some people passing a basketball back and forth, and a gorilla walks behind the scene. It's not something we're actually looking for, and we don't notice it. But what about real-world interactions? That's what Simons looks at here. Some important findings for our concept of confirmation bias come in this experiment. The experiment will parallel our point one here, the failure to notice non-confirming evidence. How so? Well, the basic setup is this. An experimenter asks a random person for directions on a map. The person helping give the directions is actually the subject. Instead of explaining the experiment, let's just watch and see our superpowers at work. In a real-world setting, the individual trying to help and give directions didn't notice the switch of the individual they were talking to. There have been follow-up studies where somebody ducks behind a counter or things like this, and you switch the people involved. And in this particular case, around half of the individuals don't even notice the switch. More importantly for us, you're more likely to notice if the switcher is part of your in-group. So if they're around the same age as you, things like that. You're less likely to notice if they're part of the out-group. We just don't pay attention to others' views or others' type of evidence as much as we might think that we do. We don't notice the details of the outsiders. We have a failure to notice things even in the real world, and we can tend to have confirmation bias as a result of this because we don't notice things that don't fit within our worldview. But things that we're expecting, things that already fit within our worldview, we notice these things. This is kind of our superpower to not notice things that challenge our fundamental beliefs or the way that we think about the world. Moving to points 2 and 3, when evidence is vague or ambiguous, we interpret it in such a way that it supports our view, and then also that we apply a higher standard of proof toward contradictory evidence. We can showcase how points 2 and 3 happen and tie into insights to Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking from his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, with one basic example here. So I'm going to show you 3 pictures. We're going to look at these. This is the first of the pictures, the second, and the third. What do these 3 have in common? Well, they're all ambiguous. Usually people read these as A, B, C, and 12, 13, 14, but they could be read as A, 13C, 12B, 14. Well, why not the other way? Why not 12B, 14? The B is very similar in the first case to the 13 here. And so why don't we read these differently? Well, the context very much so matters. It helps interpret the situation. The context can help us with our interpretation. Well, what about the middle one, though? What about Anne approaching the bank? How is that a similar idea to this? Well, most imagine Anne with money heading towards a financial bank. If the picture had instead been they were floating down the river and Anne approached the bank, you might think a little bit differently about Anne approached the bank. Either way you interpreted it, you made a choice about how to think about the evidence in front of you. Your System 1 from Kahneman's version generated a context of its own. You probably weren't even aware that you generated a context. When you're uncertain, System 1 bets on an answer. It chooses a context. It has a built-in bias to make sense of the world with your current worldview. It has a bias to believe. It matches evidence to particular contexts. It can turn a 13 into a B because your worldview is not singing you your A13Cs. It might not be saying, ah, yes, I see a 13. It's right there. And yet it may see a 13 when it's within the context of different numbers. It interprets the ambiguous favorably. Point 2 in our confirmation bias idea. Right? So we get this confirmation bias. Whatever we already believe, our System 1 is interpreting the world to match that. But if we think about point 3, we can look at the Anne approach the bank idea. When we get access to new information, there is interpretation. How important of a source is it? What context does this evidence pertain to? The standard asymmetry is that we pick our context. We pick dumb evidence context quite easily if it disagrees with our worldview. We say, oh, that doesn't really fit here, right? So we get to think about whether or not the context is relevant. And that can have us have this standard asymmetry where we can say, actually, what context is this belonging to? Is Anne approaching a financial bank or is Anne approaching a river bank, right? And then when we start to think about those things, we are picking the context that we put things in, and we could have different standards for things that fit our evidence or don't fit our evidence, and that can lead towards a confirmation bias.